Irma Grese was born on October 7, 1923, in the quiet village of Reken, in northern Germany. At first glance, her childhood seemed no different from that of thousands of other rural children, marked by poverty, rigid discipline, and the shadow of a nation in turmoil. Her father, a dairy worker, was known for his stern and often cruel authority, while her mother struggled under the weight of domestic expectations. The family was poor, and the landscape of Greece's early years was one of hardship rather than privilege. When Irma was just 13, her mother took her own life, leaving the young girl with wounds that never healed. It was in this crucible of loss and repression that Irma began to harden, though few could have predicted what path she would eventually take. She grew into a striking figure, blonde, tall and radiant by the standards of her time, but beauty in her case would become a weapon, a mask for brutality that would shock even the hardened men of war. The Germany of her youth was no ordinary place. It was a nation unraveling and reforming under Adolf Hitler's rule, where ideology invaded every schoolroom, every farm and every factory. Grese left school at 15 with no diploma, no prospects, and no clear sense of direction. She dreamed of becoming a nurse, a profession rooted in healing, but the path was barred by her lack of education. Rejected repeatedly, she drifted into odd jobs, finding work briefly in agriculture and later in a hospital, though not in the medical role she craved. Instead, she was employed as a cleaner, her aspirations thwarted and her resentment deepening. By the time she was 18, the SS had become a beacon for the disaffected, especially for young women who saw in the organization a chance to rise above the anonymity of their lives. The Waffen-SS recruited women into auxiliary roles, promising uniforms, purpose, and a sense of belonging to Hitler's vision of a new Germany. Grese, captivated by these promises, applied and was accepted as a camp guard. It was a decision that would change not only her life, but also the lives of countless others in the most terrible ways imaginable. In March 1943, Irma Grese reported for duty at Ravensbrück, a notorious women's concentration camp. Here, her transformation began, in earnest. Surrounded by cruelty, indoctrination, and the exercise of unchecked power, she seemed to absorb the camp's atmosphere like a sponge. What others recoiled from, she embraced. Prisoners would later testify that Grese displayed a kind of sadistic glee in her duties, beating, humiliating, and tormenting those under her control. Her beauty, far from softening her, became a chilling contrast to her actions. She earned the nickname the Blonde Angel of Death from those who both feared and despised her. Her rise through the ranks was swift. By the age of 20, she had transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the epicenter of the Nazi genocide. Here, she became notorious. Witnesses later described her walking through the camp with her whip, sometimes setting her trained dogs upon inmates, sometimes beating them herself. Survivors remembered her distinctive appearance, carefully groomed hair, polished boots, and an icy demeanor that made her cruelty all the more terrifying. One prisoner said it was the clash between her youthful beauty and her pitiless eyes that made her unforgettable. What transformed a farm girl from Mecklenburg into one of the most infamous women of the Third Reich? Historians have debated this endlessly. Some argue it was the combination of indoctrination, personal ambition, and the intoxicating power that came with life inside the camps. Others see her as a product of a broken home and an abusive father. Her cruelty an echo of the violence she absorbed in childhood. But perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that Grese enjoyed her role. Testimonies describe her as laughing during beatings, taking pleasure in arbitrary acts of punishment, and displaying none of the reluctance or remorse that might suggest She was simply a cog in a larger machine. By the time Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945, Grese had already fled, transferred to Bergen-Belsen as the Reich collapsed around her. Yet even there, with the war's end looming, she did not abandon her methods. Starved, sick, and dying prisoners continued to face her cruelty. Survivors remembered her as a constant presence, strolling among the corpses with a calm indifference that seemed to deny the humanity of those before her. At 21 years old, she was already infamous, though she could not have known it. Her name would be etched into the annals of history, not for her service to Germany, but for the horrors she inflicted on others. As the Allies closed in, she might have attempted to vanish into the ruins of her nation, blending back into the anonymity of a defeated people. But fate or justice had other plans. On April 15, 1945, the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen. What they found defied imagination. Tens of thousands of unburied corpses, skeletal survivors, and guards who had not yet fled. Among those captured was Irma Grese. In that moment, her power evaporated. Stripped of her whip and uniform, she was no longer the feared overseer of thousands, but a young woman in custody, facing the full reckoning of her deeds. The villagers of her homeland might scarcely have recognized her, at once so young, yet already burdened with a legacy of horror. Her trial would soon follow, and with it the world would come to know her face, her name, and the terrible choices she had made. But before she stood before the judges, before the verdict was passed and the gallows prepared, Irma Grese was still the child of Rechen, the daughter of a broken home, and the woman who had stepped willingly into darkness. The name Auschwitz has become synonymous with the abyss of human cruelty, and within its barbed wire fences, Irma Grese carved her reputation into history. When she arrived in 1943, she was still only 19, but the camp system had already shaped her into something unrecognizable from the girl who once dreamed of being a nurse. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not simply a prison. It was an entire machinery of death, and those who operated within it often surrendered whatever fragments of conscience they had left. For Grese, it seemed, the environment was not corrosive but intoxicating. Witnesses remembered her walking with calculated poise along the long rows of barracks, her boots polished to a shine, her whip swinging lazily from her hand. She dressed with a pride that struck many as chilling. Crisp uniform, neatly styled blonde hair, sometimes even a smile that belied the horror around her. Survivors later spoke of her youth and beauty, describing how utterly surreal it was to see someone who looked like a film actress presiding over selections that condemned men, women, and children to the gas chambers. The selections were the darkest moments. When new transports arrived, Irma often stood alongside Dr. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, whose infamous experiments on prisoners left scars on history itself. With a flick of her hand or a cold command, Grese directed hundreds toward either forced labor or death. For many survivors, her image at those moments became seared into memory, the face of a young woman deciding who would live and who would perish. Her cruelty was not reserved for the mass processes of the camp. Day to day, she seemed to thrive on the suffering around her. Survivors recounted how she beat prisoners with her whip for trivial infractions, sometimes for no reason at all. Others remembered the dogs she trained to attack at her command. Tearing into the already frail bodies of starving inmates, she appeared to take a certain amusement in these acts, as though they were not atrocities but entertainments. One witness claimed she often laughed as she carried out punishments, her laughter echoing more frighteningly than her whip. And yet, there was also something enigmatic about her. Prisoners testified that Grese sometimes appeared almost bored, walking among the dying without acknowledgement, as if she were wandering through a world that had lost all meaning except for the control she exerted over it. Her indifference could be as terrifying as her violence. To be seen by her was to risk pain. To be ignored was to remain in a limbo of silent dread. The scale of her notoriety spread quickly through the prisoners' whispers. Rumors of the blonde angel circulated in hushed voices, each story worse than the last. Some spoke of her personal vanity, her mirror polished even as corpses piled outside. Others told of her fascination with Mengele, of a strange devotion that tied her more closely to the machinery of death. Whether these tales were wholly accurate or products of fearful imagination, they all contributed to the aura of menace that surrounded her. But even within the regime of terror, the war was shifting. By late 1944, the Soviet advance pressed closer to Auschwitz. The Nazis, determined to hide evidence of their crimes, began evacuating prisoners and guards alike. In November of that year, Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. She was only 21 years old, yet already infamous among the prisoners who recognized her upon arrival. If Auschwitz had been a factory of death, Belsen was a graveyard of the living. Food supplies had collapsed, disease swept through the overcrowded barracks, and tens of thousands starved amid squalor. Even hardened SS personnel were unprepared for the chaos, but Grese continued her duties as if nothing had changed. Survivors later testified that she patrolled the camp with the same cold assurance, enforcing order with whips and fists while thousands perished around her. There was a strange duality in Belsen. The war's end was palpable. Allied bombers thundered in the skies. Rumors of German defeat spread among guards and prisoners alike. Yet in the camp, daily life remained a nightmare. Grese, despite the crumbling Reich, did not abandon her role. Perhaps she believed the Reich would still prevail, or perhaps she could not imagine life outside the uniform. Either way, her cruelty endured. By April 1945, Bergen-Belsen had become a vision of hell on earth. Over 10,000 unburied corpses lay strewn across the camp, and those still alive staggered between the dead in a haze of hunger and typhus. When the British Army entered on April 15th, the stench alone was enough to make hardened soldiers gag. Cameras recorded what they found: mountains of emaciated bodies, skeletal survivors barely able to stand, and SS guards, some defiant, some apathetic, some begging for mercy. Among those captured that day was Irma Grese. Stripped of her whip and authority, she was now a prisoner herself. Photographs taken shortly after her arrest show her seated in custody, still striking in appearance, but diminished. A young woman barely more than 20, suddenly fragile in the face of the world she had once terrorized. For the survivors who saw her under guard, there was a sense of justice long overdue. The woman who had once chosen life or death with a flick of her hand now had no power to command anything. But justice would not be swift. It would come in the form of the Belsen trial, where her actions at Auschwitz and Belsen would be laid bare before the world. And there, in the courtroom, the mask she had worn for years would finally crack. The shadows of the camps followed her, carried in the voices of witnesses who would describe every beating, every scream, every cruelty. And as she faced the judges, Irma Grese, once the blonde beast, once the angel of death, would come to realize that history had no mercy. The collapse of the Third Reich brought with it an avalanche of reckoning. As Allied forces uncovered camps across Germany, the world was forced to confront horrors beyond imagination. In the weeks following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the British military authorities moved swiftly to bring its SS personnel to trial. Among those singled out for prosecution was the young woman who had become a symbol of cruelty, Irma Grese. The proceedings that followed, known as the Belsen trial, were conducted by a British military court in Lüneburg, beginning in September 1945. The courtroom itself was a repurposed gymnasium, stark and utilitarian, but inside it carried the weight of history. The accused, 45 in total, were brought before the court, a mix of male and female SS officers, doctors, and functionaries. Grese, seated among them, was instantly recognizable. Her youth and striking appearance made her stand out, but so too did her reputation, which already preceded her into the chamber. Witness after witness stepped forward, many of them survivors of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Their testimonies painted a consistent portrait. Irma Grese had been more than just a guard. She had been an overseer of terror. Prisoners recalled the lashing she delivered with her braided whip, the savage beatings, the attacks with dogs, and above all, her role in selections for the gas chambers. Some described her laughter during acts of cruelty, a detail that struck the court with chilling force. Grese listened to these accusations with a composure that bewildered observers. At only 21, she sat in the dock with her back straight, her expression calm, even detached. Journalists noted her demeanor, describing her as oddly serene, even when confronted with the most damning evidence. There were no tears, no visible remorse, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. Instead, she occasionally smiled, as though the proceedings were of little consequence. Her defense rested largely on denial and minimization. She admitted to being present at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, but denied committing atrocities. She claimed she was simply following orders, that her role was administrative, and that the testimonies against her were exaggerated or fabricated. At one point, she insisted that she had never personally killed anyone, arguing that responsibility lay with the higher authorities of the SS. But the sheer weight of survivor testimony, corroborated by multiple witnesses who had never met each other, made her denials ring hollow. One detail that shocked the court was her age. To many observers, it was incomprehensible that a woman barely out of her teens could have risen so quickly into a role of power, and even more so that she could have wielded that power with such cruelty. Reporters covering the trial often remarked on the surreal contrast between her youthful beauty and the monstrous deeds being described. Photographs of her during the trial circulated widely, cementing her image as the blonde beast in the eyes of the world. But the trial was not solely about Grese. The court sought to establish the broader culpability of the camp staff, to document for history the crimes committed in those places of suffering. Yet as day after day of testimony unfolded, it became clear that Grese embodied in a single figure the face of the camp system's brutality. Her name appeared in more testimonies than nearly any other defendant. By November 1945, after weeks of evidence and argument, the verdicts were delivered. Of the 45 defendants, 11 were sentenced to death, including Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, and Irma Grese. When the sentence was read aloud, observers noted that Grese did not cry out or collapse. Instead, she remained composed, even serene. Some accounts suggest she smiled faintly, as though unfazed by the inevitability of her fate. Her composure unnerved many. In private conversations with fellow prisoners, she reportedly expressed a kind of fatalism, claiming she had expected no other outcome. Yet she also displayed flashes of bravado, telling one guard that she was proud to be the youngest woman condemned by the Allies. Whether these statements were genuine or a mask to hide her fear remains unknown. In the weeks between her sentencing and her execution, Grese was held in a cell at Hamelin Prison under close supervision. Guards described her as calm, polite, and cooperative. She read books, wrote occasional notes, and maintained her poise. There were no signs of remorse, no confessions of guilt, no letters of apology. She seemed to approach death with the same detachment with which she had approached her trial. The man chosen to carry out the sentence was Britain's official executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, a figure whose name had already become infamous across Europe. He travelled to Hamelin in December 1945 to prepare for a series of executions, the largest in modern British history, as 11 condemned prisoners were scheduled to hang within 2 days. Among them was the young woman who had once commanded life and death in the camps. On the eve of her execution, Grese reportedly remained composed. She was offered spiritual counsel but declined, showing no interest in prayer or confession. Prison staff later remarked on her almost eerie tranquility. At 22 years old, she was about to face the gallows, yet she betrayed no outward sign of terror. The dawn of December 13, 1945, was cold and bleak in Hamelin. Outside the prison, the world stirred little, unaware that history was being made within its walls. For Grese, the final chapter had arrived. The prison at Hamelin was silent in the early hours of December 13, 1945. Inside its thick stone walls, 11 condemned prisoners awaited the final judgment of the rope. Among them was Irma Grese, just 22 years old, the youngest woman to be executed under British authority in the 20th century. For months, she had carried herself with an uncanny calm, a composure that unsettled those charged with guarding her. Now, with dawn breaking and footsteps echoing down the cold corridors, her fate was no longer a distant prospect. It was minutes away. Albert Pierrepoint, the chief executioner, had arrived days earlier to make his meticulous preparations. He was a man known for efficiency, for turning execution into a clinical process devoid of spectacle. There would be no prolonged suffering, no lingering cruelty. The British prided themselves on the swiftness of justice. For Grese, who had once held the power of life and death in her own hands, the roles were reversed. She was no longer the overseer. She was the condemned. At 5:30 in the morning, the guards entered her cell. Accounts from that day describe her as awake, alert, and composed. Unlike many prisoners who collapsed into despair in their final hours, Grese greeted her captors with a kind of brisk finality. She dressed neatly for the occasion, wearing a black skirt, white blouse, and sensible shoes. The woman who had been called the blonde beast looked almost ordinary, almost fragile. Yet her expression remained calm, her blue eyes unclouded. By fear, the condemned were executed in pairs, brought in turn to the gallows that had been erected within the prison. Irma Grese was scheduled second, following her fellow overseer, Elisabeth Volkenrath. The ritual was swift. The prisoner was led into the chamber, hands bound, the noose waiting above. The hangman performed his duties with precision, the trapdoor. Released and justice delivered in silence. When the guards came for Grese, she rose quickly from her seat. Witnesses noted her remarkable composure, even her strange air of confidence. She walked firmly down the corridor, her footsteps steady. At the door to the execution chamber, she is said to have uttered a final word, "Schnell! Quick!" It was not a plea for mercy, but a command, spoken as though she still held authority. Some believed it was bravado, an attempt to meet death on her own terms. Others saw it as a final mask, concealing fear she would not allow anyone to see. The hood was placed over her head, the noose adjusted. At precisely 10:03 a.m., the trapdoor opened, and Irma Grese dropped into silence. Death came swiftly, as Pierrepoint intended. The young woman who had once commanded terror in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen was gone in an instant. Her life ended not by war, not by accident, but by the deliberate hand of justice. The executions continued throughout the morning. By midday, 11 members of the SS had met their end at Hamelin, their names recorded in the official ledger, their bodies buried in unmarked graves. For many of the survivors who had testified, the knowledge of Grese's execution brought a measure of closure, though not relief. No gallows could undo the years of torment, the lost families, the thousands who had perished under her watch. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. In the days that followed, the story of Irma Grese's execution spread quickly across Europe. Newspapers reported every detail, fascinated by the incongruity of her youth and beauty with the crimes attributed to her. Photographs from the trial, Grese smiling faintly in the dock, her hair neatly arranged, appeared alongside headlines that labeled her the Blonde Beast and the Angel of Death. To the public, she became a symbol of the perverse seduction, of Nazism, of how ordinary people, young, attractive, seemingly unremarkable, could become instruments of extraordinary cruelty. Historians would later debate her legacy. Was she a sadist, driven by personal pleasure in cruelty? Was she a product of indoctrination, swept up in a system that demanded absolute obedience? Or was she, as some argued, a hollow figure who found purpose only in wielding the small measure of authority given to her? The testimonies from survivors left little doubt about her actions, but her inner motives remained elusive. What is certain is that her death marked a turning point in how the world perceived female perpetrators of atrocity. Until then, many had clung to the belief that women were incapable of such brutality, that cruelty on such a scale was the domain of men. Irma Grese shattered that illusion. Her youth and gender made her trial and execution all the more striking, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil. Today, her name remains infamous, not for her beauty or her age, but for what she chose to become. From a farm girl in Mecklenburg to a camp overseer, from a dream of nursing to the gallows at Hamelin, her life traced a path that revealed the darkest capacities of the human heart. At the end, there was no redemption, no last confession, no whispered apology to the ghosts of Auschwitz and Bergen, only a final word, "Quick!" and the sudden silence of a body dropping through a trapdoor. For the survivors who lived on, her memory was not one of mystery, but of terror, and her execution stood as a warning carved into history, that evil, when given power, can wear even the most innocent face. And so, on that cold December morning in 1945, the story of Irma Grese ended, not with glory, not with grace, but with the swift snap of a rope and the long echo of the crimes she could never escape.